Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to online lecture 5C here in your Biology 140 semester. Well, guys, we're going to be at slides 2 up to about, say, slides 16 or so. I think we'll probably just look at these 14 slides in today's online lecture, and we'll save slide 17 on forward for class where we'll have a lecture. But guys, let's see this opening photograph here, this little toddler sipping on some milk inside of a bottle. And what might be in that plastic bottle? Maybe a substance called BPA. So here in Chapter 8, guys, we're going to be looking at environmental health and toxicology. We'll be looking at how sort of different substances, and not just substances, it can be a lot of things, but any kind of external factor that causes disease is addressed by environmental health. And so we'll be looking at external factors that can come in, say, to this little toddler's body and affect his or her health. And so BPA, bisphenol A, is one that has many potential health effects. Basically, BPA is a plastic-like liner. You find it along baby bottles, eyeglass lenses, headlights, CDs, DVDs, water pipes, linings of all types of cans and bottles, even as a tooth-protecting sealant. And it's actually a hormone derivative. So it's a synthetic estrogen. So it acts like the hormone estrogen. And, of course, people, we know what estrogen does, right? It gives people feminine traits. It could affect sexuality. It could affect development of genitals. There are genital defects in males that have happened in rats and mice. It can cause mammary and prostate cancer, possible cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, early onset of puberty in females, or when females are having their first period much earlier, obesity, liver enzyme abnormalities. There's so many different things that this BPA has been correlated with in rats and mice. And when they say correlate, it means that as the BPA levels went up, these different diseases and health effects went up also. Now, does that mean that BPA is causing more heart disease or genital defects in males? Not necessarily. It's linked, or there's a correlation there, but we don't know for sure if it's the direct cause. In fact, before we get very far, I want y'all to watch this little segment here on BPA in our food. Came out a couple years ago from MyFox New York. Just check this out. All right, guys, very controversial. I think you'll find a lot of things in Chapter 8 are potentially controversial. I don't want to make you scared when you watch these videos, but I want you to be informed. 95% of us have detectable levels of BPA in our bodies in urine tests. We know it's out there. We know it's in our bodies. There's no doubt about that it can leach or come out of the plastic containers and enter our bodies. But what does it actually affect, and how does it affect us? You'll hear different things from different folks. The scientific community and the government agencies oftentimes will say it is dangerous. It's affecting mice. Of course, mice are genetically different than us. They're not exactly the same as us. Their physiology is somewhat different. They can eat different things than us in many cases. So, is it just happening in just mice and rats? We haven't actually really tested this directly in people. That could even be a major lawsuit to test it in people. It could be unethical. So we use rats and mice in most of these types of studies, and we've seen that they've been affected. Again, having things like male genitalia deformities, where the genitalia aren't forming properly in males. Makes sense if it's a female sex hormone. Anyway, this could really have an effect on us. Obviously, you've heard two different viewpoints, mostly the more the governmental viewpoint, but the manufacturers of things like soups and plastic containers, of course, they all deny that there are effects or any kind of problem with humans, probably because we haven't tested humans, but again, that's because it will be unethical and dangerous. So, guys, welcome to Chapter 8. Let's look at the outline. Today we're going to look at environmental health, infectious and emergent diseases. I think you'll find these topics very interesting. and something that could potentially affect your health and your family's health, so you ought to pay attention. And antibiotics and pesticide resistance, and then we'll save toxicology for the next lecture, which will be in class, and that's where the test will end, right after toxicology. So let's go ahead and look at slide 4. And we'll begin our slideshow presentation. So if you go ahead and see, entitled Environmental Health, let's look at some of the definitions. As we get into Chapter 8, we need to make sure we're very clear on these fundamental terms before we get deeper into the chapter. So health, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And how many of you are in a state of health? None of us. None of us have achieved complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So we are all in a state of, you might call it disease, or we're all in a state of, say, less than health. We're all ill to some extent. We're not completely physically fine, right? There's probably something in your body that doesn't work just perfectly, or you have some pain, or you're not quite perfectly physically fit for one reason or another, or maybe mentally something's not quite right. I know I feel that way a lot of times. Social well-being, yeah, I think all of us probably don't feel socially adequate at times. So all of us don't fit the picture-perfect health state. That is something that we strive to shoot for, and it's nice to have it out there, but it's not very realistic. So none of us are in perfect health. Along with the word health, let's look at what disease would be. So if we don't have health, then there could either be some type of illness or a disease, an abnormal change in the body's condition that impairs either physical or psychological function. So if you had knee problems and you had developed some type of, say, tendinitis in the knee, that could be considered a disease. It does change the body's condition and impairs your physical function. When you have tendinitis, it's very painful. Or it could be psychological as well. There could be something like attention deficit disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. There are a host of psychological disorders, right? There's bipolar. There's depression can be a type of psychological function problem. So we see disease as more than just physical, and disease, of course, keeps us away from perfect health. Diet, nutrition, infectious agents, toxic chemicals, even your genetics, trauma, and psychological stress all play roles in morbidity, which is your illness, and mortality, which is your death. And so we have morbidity leads to mortality. And in Chapter 8, we're going to explore how your diet, how your nutrition can affect morbidity and your mortality. Infectious agents, we're going to go through many different kinds. Toxic chemicals like BPA, genetics, which this chapter doesn't explore as much, but which you would explore a lot more in a general biology course. Trauma and psychological stress, so like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. All of these things affect our morbidity and our mortality. So all these factors play a role. Let's look at environmental health risks. So when we look at environmental health, we're looking at things that come in from the outside. So environmental health, we are focused on things that are coming in from the outside into our bodies, like bacteria, protozoa, viruses. Infectious agents, that's all in that category. How about parasitic worms, right? That's all in that group. Any typically living thing could be a virus, which is pseudo-living, amoeba, etc. Anything that would come into your body that's a living thing and infect your body and hurt your body is an infectious agent. Traumas come through accidents. It could be work-related. It could be car accidents. Could be sporting injuries. Those are trauma. Pollution, right? Air, noise, water pollution. There are a lot of different forms of pollution that come in, not just air or water, even noise. Even light pollution could affect your health. How in the world could light pollution affect your health? Well, let's say you're in a city where it's always bright, always light, lots of lights on. You may not sleep as well. If you don't sleep as well, yeah, not sleeping as well can actually cause heart disease. There have been a lot of studies showing correlations between poor sleep and heart disease. So, yeah, even light pollution could affect your health. Radiation, ionizing radiation, UV rays, right, just from the sun, which is very natural. Chemicals, lead, smoking, these are all toxins. And notice that as we went through these different things, some are from man or man that caused or produced, and others are from nature. It's both. So we're always being assaulted by both natural and what we might call unnatural or artificial things. Okay, let's look at the global disease burden. So let's look at some of the bad news, and we'll also look at the good news. First of all, how about we go into some of the good news? Overall, global disease is down. For example, child mortality has fallen dramatically over the past 50 years. We expect that to continue to drop. We see deaths that were around 240 deaths at birth, 240 deaths per 1,000. So a 24% chance of deaths for children at birth. So about a quarter of all childbirths resulted in death back in 1960. Now the world average is, maybe only 6 deaths per birth. So we went from about a quarter, or 1 in 4 deaths at birth. Now we're down to 6 deaths out of 6%, or 6 out of 100. So it's dramatically dropped. In North America, back in 1960, we were only having about 3% deaths, or 3 out of 100. Now we're down to, maybe only 0.5% deaths at birth. So we've seen a lot of improvements. How about our life expectancies? Yeah, the average global life expectancies have more than doubled over the past century. So over the past 100 years, we've gone from a life expectancy of 30 years to 64 years. Many more people are reaching old age. We're starting to see that we are definitely living longer. Disease is not as much of a problem. We've knocked out things like polio and smallpox. For the most part, AIDS is even very treatable. The average person that tests HIV positive now lives 24 years, guys, when treated with medicine. So overall, we're seeing improvements. But we still have a major global disease burden. It could get worse. So life expectancy increases as infant mortality decreases. So as I mentioned, infant mortality has gone from a global average of close to 24 to 25%. It's dropped way down to 6% or less. So we see a lot of children living a lot longer, babies surviving birth, and then that's also correlated with longer life expectancies, again around 30 up to say 64, just over the past century. Now, when we look at global disease burden, we don't want to just look at deaths and births. We look at this thing called disability adjusted life years, guys. That's DALYs. Combine premature deaths and loss of healthy life resulting from illness or disability. So we're not just looking at the death. We're looking at how, say, an accident may have affected you. So the DALYs would say, all right, well, if someone, say, hurts their leg when they're a teenager, and for the rest of their life, that hurt leg affects their health and affects their ability to move, that would, of course, resulted in a very high disability-adjusted life years, versus someone that has a major heart attack at the age of 80 and then suddenly dies. That's actually not very high, because that person lived 80 years and then suddenly abruptly ended, versus the person that had this chronic injury that they had to live with for so long. So disability-adjusted life years is actually a more accurate way of looking at how a disease or illness affects health. Chronic conditions account for premature death and disease in both developed and developing countries today. So we have a lot of chronic conditions. And what would that be? Something like heart disease or diabetes we would call chronic. Like diabetes results in premature deaths. A lot of people with diabetes don't live as long. They have a lot of heart problems along the way too. Heart disease may actually become the leading source of disability and disease worldwide, and we'll see global cancer rates increase by up to 50%. What is going on? Why is heart disease and cancer rate, why is it going up so much by 2020? If we're doing better, and if our life expectancies are going from 30 to 64 in 100 years, why are we seeing heart disease and cancer suddenly spike, and even diabetes? Well, folks, the world is getting older. Remember back 100 years ago, we have a life expectancy of 30. There's not time for heart disease to develop. There's not time for cancer to become as much of a problem. And very few people would have developed diabetes by the age of 30. But now we're living the age of 64, and that's a global thing. It doesn't matter if you're in a developed country or a developing country, we are all living a lot longer. And so those chronic diseases are becoming more a problem. This is what we call epidemiological transition. Again, an epidemiological transition is what we're calling this, where chronic conditions become more of a killer. In developing countries, it used to be infections. Someone would get some type of an infection in their body, maybe malaria, could be other things. Then the maternal and prenatal birth complications, nutritional deficiencies, those are the kinds of things that were killing people in developing countries 50 years ago and 100 years ago. Now it's becoming things like cancer and heart attack and other things. We're treating those typical diseases that were killing people, those tropical illnesses, etc. Now we're living longer, so we're starting to see cancer rates and heart attack going up in other countries. So let's now go on to the next slide here. Let's see if it'll let us do that. And yeah, there we go. Global disease burden. Let's talk a little bit more about how things are changing. Okay, so diabetes is on the increase. I mentioned that one. 1/3 of children in North America born today will develop diabetes in their lifetime due to poor diet and little exercise. That comes with being developed, right? North America is a generally developed area. The United States, Canada, even a lot of Mexico is rather developed. And so we have a lot of jobs where we kind of sit in one place all day, sit in front of a computer, get on our social media devices, right, our iPhones, etc. We have poor diet, we have little exercise. That combination results in diabetes. And in developing countries where you're more active and you have more of a physical lifestyle at your work, and you don't have the social media devices as much and television, you're more active, diabetes is not much of a problem, but it's becoming more of a problem there too. The World Health Organization, the WHO, projects that psychological conditions could increase their share up 5% from 10 to 15%. So as modern life begins to spill into these developing countries, we think depression will go up. Yeah, isn't that interesting? The developed countries have more issues with depression. At the same time, though, we'll say depression will be the second largest cause of all years lived with disability. And this is either in developing or developed countries. So depression is a problem all over the world, but it's traditionally been more of a problem in developed nations. Maybe it's the stress of work. Maybe it's the lack of exercise. It's lots of different things may be going on here causing our depression. Did y'all know that 1 in 4 women will commit suicide? That's how high the worldwide suicide rate is for women. 1 in 4 women commit suicide. Isn't that shocking how high that is? Well, if you look at the condition of a lot of women in the world and look at the situations they're in, the lack of freedom, the sex trafficking, the abuse they suffer at the hands of husbands and societies that oppress them and keep them from having a say, you might understand why it is up to 1 out of 4. Just shocking. I don't know what that number is for men, but it's a lot less. Tobacco-related lung diseases are increasing. We're seeing more and more people discovering the world of smoking cigarettes. And this is really taking off in developing countries. Who knew that tobacco use was just really taking off in developing countries? Yeah, a lot of the young people. Remember, where are all the young people in the world? Most of the young people are in developing countries, right, guys? And so there we're seeing a lot of people taking on smoking habits. They're becoming addicted at extremely high rates. I think it's 100 million, or no, it's 100,000. 100,000 become addicted to tobacco every day. Every single day, 100,000 new young people become addicted to tobacco, and 1.1 billion people out of the 7.2 billion people now smoke. We think that maybe 500 million people alive today will eventually be killed by tobacco. Wow, folks, that's like a jumbo jet, like a bunch of jumbo jets crashing every single day. Imagine if several jumbo jets crashed every single day. Imagine, how much news coverage that would get. Well, that's how many people are dying of smoking every day. Of course, that doesn't get any media attention. All right, infectious diseases. Let's talk about that. So infectious diseases, which we think of as more like a developing country problem, also found in developed countries. We'll talk about some examples in a minute. So communicable diseases are still responsible for a third of all disease-related deaths. Communicable diseases like the flu. Majority in countries with poor nutrition, sanitation, and vaccination. So communicable diseases are mainly a problem in developing countries, but they're only about a third in more of our developed nations anyway. New diseases test our defenses in developed countries as well. We are not immune. We have flu viruses that frequently mutate. I don't know if you guys realize this, but the flu vaccine this year here in western North Carolina, and the one given across the state and probably most of the United States, was only 24% effective. So even if you got the flu shot, it didn't really work because a different strain really showed up. The strain they thought would be a big problem this year wasn't the harmful strain. A whole different one came in and, of course, caused a lot of suffering. Better nutrition, clean water, improved sanitation, inoculation of children could eliminate most of the deaths. Notice nothing mentioned about wonder drugs or very expensive health care. Just simply better nutrition, simply better clean water, better sanitation, those kinds of things could eliminate most of these deaths that are occurring in places like in our poor nations especially. So infectious diseases, again, like the flu, like bacterial infections, MRSA, we'll talk about those here in just a little while. Pathogens, let's discuss those. This is something we cover a lot in general biology courses. We talk about viruses, bacteria, protozoans, and many others. Let's go through a few of them. So pathogens are disease-causing organisms. Viruses aren't technically organisms. They're not truly living, but they're considered disease-causing, we'll put them in quotes, organisms. Viruses, again, think of things like the flu, the worst worldwide pandemic, that we ever had occurred in 1918. 1918, we saw the swine flu affect about a third of the entire world. Millions of people died from this horrible pandemic. So the flu is a big one. Bird flu is another one that came out years ago. That was an emergent disease as well. Let's see, the stomach flu, norovirus, causes lots of people to miss work, causes lots of people to stay home, can even kill people. That's been a big problem, noro. So all this is flu caused. Colds, all your colds, your flus, this is all viral caused. Bacteria, they cause things like food poisoning, like Salmonella enterica. Salmonella, which we find sometimes outbreaks in eggs, sometimes even in things like fruits such as melons. There's a horrible bacterial outbreak that occurred in Wisconsin called Cryptosporidium. Cryptosporidium struck parts of Wisconsin. It actually came from cow manure. It was cows that were feeding just outside of places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the heavy rains in Wisconsin in 1993. There were some major floods, guys, in 93, and those floods washed a lot of the cysts from Cryptosporidium parvum, and that those little cysts wound up, kind of like spores, cysts wound up in the water supply in Milwaukee, and millions of people hundreds of thousands of people actually more like got sick. It would cost millions of dollars. So bacteria, again, think of Salmonella, E. coli, H1N1 is this strain of E. coli that's killed a lot of people, made a lot of people sick. So most of your food poisonings are caused by bacteria. Coliform, again, E. coli in our water supply, that's, of course, a major cause of illness. Protozoans include things like amoeba. Amoeba that causes amoebic dysentery, horrible form of diarrhea. Cholera would be something more bacterial caused. So viruses, bacteria, and protozoans could cause things like diarrhea and vomiting. Protozoans, this include not only amoebas, they include paramecia. They include all types of, slightly larger organisms that can cause major sicknesses. Parasitic worms, including flukes, tapeworms, blood flukes, liver flukes, things that damage the liver. All these things are what we call pathogens. The greatest loss of life, again, was that 1918 flu. Killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. Killed my great-grandfather, guys. He was a dentist, and that's how he died. Malaria is a major disease in tropical areas. Malaria is a protozoan. It is called Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium. It kills 600,000 people a year, and it mutates. It changes. The DNA of the malarial parasite always changes, and so we have to come up with new drugs to treat it. It's expected to rise significantly, guys. We see many more cases of malaria, and of course, climate change or global warming would not help things, right? Because if it gets warmer, mosquitoes can live in more places and spread the disease more. So that's a big theme throughout Chapter 8, how climate change might cause pathogens and vectors which are organisms that spread these pathogens, and allow them to live in new areas and move north. An emergent disease is one not previously known or which one has been absent for at least 20 years. So bird flu, not a big concern years ago, suddenly popped up in Asia and spread across the United States. You also see acute respiratory distress, SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome that swept around the world in 2003, almost killed a friend of mine. It all started with a doctor in Hong Kong where he picked up the infection from some of the poultry and wildlife markets in China, spread that all over the place because of global transportation. Global transportation helps a lot of this stuff to spread. We used to only have about 3 million people traveling by air, say in the middle 20th century. Now we see 300 million people flying in airplanes on a regular basis, spreading these diseases. Ebola fever is a new one. HIV is relatively new. Hadn't really hardly heard of this thing 30 years ago. Now HIV has spread worldwide and is causing a lot of people to die, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a big, big problem. Cholera. Some places like South America hadn't seen cholera in years. Suddenly popped up in Peru in 1992. Tuberculosis, drug-resistant tuberculosis popped up in Russia. Wow. All these things are popping up. Why? Well, part of it's air travel. Makes it possible to spread emergent diseases. Having 7.2 billion people to harbor these pathogens is part of the problem, too. There are a lot more people in which these pathogens can dwell. And the more people they can dwell in, the more time they have to mutate. We see new strains, along with air travel, and we see major outbreaks popping up. Here's a nice map. It's not really a positive map, but it's a nice way of visualizing these things. Mad cow disease is an emergent disease. We haven't seen it much. Pops up in England, causes these farmers out here to slaughter thousands and thousands of cows, losing millions of dollars in beef. Cryptosporidium parvum in 1993, again, that's Wisconsin. Hantavirus in the southwest U.S. Chronic kidney disease down here in Central America, dengue fever. Cholera, again, showing up here in Peru. Ulcers, Marburg fever. How about this area that I'm circling right here, guys? You know what virus popped out here? What was it that popped out here in 2014, late summer? Ebola virus, right? Ebola virus popped up here in this part of Africa. Pneumonic plague, 1994. Drug resistant, again, we mentioned the tuberculosis in Russia, 97. SARS, 2003, spread across the whole world. Bird flu, 2004. Wow, just amazing outbreaks of new diseases, or diseases that we basically thought we had eradicated, have popped up. Now let's look at some diseases that affect not just humans, but affect animals and organisms that are very important in our natural world. So in ecological diseases, we see animal epidemics, like white nose syndrome in bats, right? You guys have probably heard of this. Some of you may have gone to Linville Caverns. If you go to Linville Caverns, they'll make you dip your feet into a bleach solution before you enter the cave. That's to make sure you killed off the spores of the fungus that spreads white nose syndrome in bats, where bats actually have the white nose from the fungus growing on the nose of the body and the fungus growing across their bodies. It makes bats wake up in the middle of hibernation and fly around and burn what little body fat they have. They only have 2 grams of body fat. And if they wake up and fly around, they will lose those 2 grams pretty quickly, and they will not survive the winter. Some people say that all bats could be eliminated in the eastern United States within 20 years. That's shocking. So again, how that gets spread, we don't know exactly how it's getting around so well, but it's popping up all over the eastern U.S., and it showed up originally in upstate New York. California sea lions are starting to pick up herpes 1 virus, getting there from human sewage. So human sewage from a sexually transmitted disease, wow, it's getting into the water in the Pacific Ocean, and California sea lions are picking up herpes virus from humans. How awful. Imported fungus is killing oak, redwoods, Douglas fir trees in California. How about the chestnut blight that came in the early 20th century, knocking out all of our chestnuts? 1 in 4 trees, guys, in this area was an American chestnut. Now American chestnuts are just tiny sprouts. They can't even become mature now. Dermo, a parasite of oysters, is spreading rapidly along the East Coast due to climate warming. Dermo was only in the Gulf of Mexico, just say 20, well, I guess it was more like 70 years ago. This protozoan started out in the Gulf and then worked its way up the East Coast. We think as the Atlantic has warmed due to climate change, the parasite has been able to work its way up the coast, and now is even found in parts of Maine. They found it in the oysters. It just wipes out oysters, guys. Doesn't hurt us, but kills them. So ecological diseases have been a major problem. How about Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis? Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis is horrible. It causes chytridiomycosis. Chytridiomycosis is a disease of the skin of amphibians. It kills amphibians like frogs and toads and salamanders. It's spread all over the place, actually causing some amphibian species to become extinct. Cryptosporidium, or chytridiomycosis, I should say. Chytridiomycosis is spread very rapidly thanks to humans. Conservation medicine, we're looking at how environmental changes threaten the health of humans and natural communities. This is a new area of discipline that's really popping up because so many diseases are emerging. So we want to look at how environmental changes such as global warming, climate change, and other things like that lead to other changes that then eventually threaten the health of humans and other natural communities. So, for example, like looking at the dermo parasite and how global warming caused dermo to spread up the East Coast, which is killing oyster populations, and then maybe other organisms that feed on oysters. That's something that conservation medicine would examine. It's a very new area. Again, it's going to be more and more popular as perhaps an actual major in college, starting probably in places like University of North Carolina at Wilmington probably. Pesticide resistance. Well, we've been using so many pesticides for so long. We used pesticides heavily in the 1950s and 1960s, and that was kind of the heyday of pesticide resistance. We killed so many insects, invading insects. And we actually wiped out almost all the pests in some cases in the 50s and 60s. But then by the 80s, the pests had developed a lot of resistance, and now many of them are here to stay. So, for example, the protozoan parasite Plasmodium falciparum, the one that causes malaria, is now resistant to most anti-malarial drugs, while the mosquitoes that transmit the protozoan have developed resistance to the insecticides. They almost had wiped out the mosquito and the protozoan in the 50s and 60s, but because of natural selection and the ability of organisms to evolve rapidly, it has come back. We tend to overuse pesticides, and that speeds up the process. Let me show you how this works, guys. Let's say we have, let's say we're talking about the mosquitoes that spread malaria. Those mosquitoes are called Anopheles mosquitoes, and they're spreading the Plasmodium falciparum, the protozoan parasite that causes malaria. And so let's just use circles to represent the mosquitoes. So here's a mosquito, and here's a mosquito. These are all just different mosquitoes in a population. And let's say this mosquito right here with the X on it has resistance to the insecticide. And so here are the other mosquitoes, okay? Now let's spray the population. So everybody in this population is going to die except who, guys? That's right, the one with the X on it, because it has resistance. So now the mosquito with the X on it survives, and then it's the only one that survives, and it gives birth to many mosquitoes that have the resistance. Now we have an entire population of mosquitoes that all have the resistance. So we have to come up with another insecticide and spray them with that. And of course, there's a good chance that another organism in the group will have resistance to that insecticide, and the process repeats. So when we tend to overuse pesticides, we tend to speed up this process I just showed you. And that process I just showed you is natural selection, where in this case humans were acting as the selection agent. Nature can do it just as well. In this case, humans spraying the mosquitoes with insecticide was the natural selection process. This results in evolution, where now the population has all resistance over here. And so when we use a lot of antibiotic soaps, and when we use a lot of antibiotics or even pesticides, we will see more natural selection and more resistant strains show up. That's why it's very important, if you get an antibiotic, guys, to use the antibiotic and use it completely. Don't just wait until your symptoms go away. Use it thoroughly so you wipe out the population entirely. And also, don't beg for antibiotics unless you absolutely need them. Doctors are trying to only use them as a last sort of, I guess, a dire request. I mean, it's a last measure. We don't want to just prescribe antibiotics because we don't want more natural selection resulting in resistant strains. Okay, folks, so here's the antibiotic resistance. This is what I was just kind of talking about a second ago. Let's go ahead and erase some of this. Let's look at some of the facts about antibiotic resistance. So antibiotics are chemicals that kill or inhibit the growth of bacteria. We've been using them since the early 20th century, like things like penicillin. But we don't finish the full course. We create resistant strains, and so we see things like MRSA pop up. What is MRSA? You've heard about it a lot probably, right? Popping up in hospitals. I know there's a couple cases of MRSA popping up at Grace here locally in Burke County. So what is it? Well, the S and the A stand for Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is the name of the bacterial species, and it's on your skin. It's all over the place. We all have that. It's very common and basically harmless when it stays on your skin. If it gets into a cut, it can cause an infection. It can cause sore throats and minor skin infections. But if it's MRSA, it's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It means it's resistant to at least a few antibiotics, at least one in particular, and that causes people to die. So MRSA is a just really horrible form of Staphylococcus aureus that has spread to the U.S. and China, resulting in thousands of deaths. Over 19,000 deaths are estimated to have occurred from over 100,000 MRSA infections. That's a pretty high rate, guys. So about 19% of those that pick up MRSA have died of it. It's a pretty high death rate. So if you get MRSA, there's about a 19% chance of mortality based on these numbers. And that's in the United States. Half of the 100 million antibiotic doses prescribed in the U.S. are unnecessary or the wrong drug. So a lot of doctors, physician assistants, a lot of folks in medicine are prescribing antibiotics when they should not be doing it, to make patients happy or maybe to make more money, to make the drug company happy, who knows. But that's way too many. Also, another bigger problem is antibiotics are routinely fed to U.S. farm animals to stimulate weight gain. So U.S. farm animals, whether they're sick or not, are automatically given antibiotics, routinely. It's just done. Chickens as well. They are excreted then. The antibiotics wind up in the urine and the feces, find their way into surface waters, where they create more antibiotic resistance in natural bacterial populations. So even if we stop using antibiotics in the human world, which is really not a good idea because a lot of people really do need them, they're going to be in the animal world and getting into our environment easily. So these are all disturbing things. This is showing you how antibiotic resistance works. So here we got an antibiotic being exposed to a bacterial colony. One of the bacteria has a mutation. Notice that in blue right there. The resistant bacteria survives and then gives birth or divides through binary fission to create a whole resistant colony. Now they all have the resistant gene here in blue. And that's how MRSA came about. How about this other way? Conjugation is a way to transfer drug resistance. So bacteria can actually share their special genes with others. So this bacterium right here has the gene for antibiotic resistance. It gives its neighboring bacterial partner here the gene through the process of conjugation. Now we have a harmful drug-resistant bacterium, and we will result in a resistant colony. So it's not just a mutation popping up, one surviving, and then a whole new population developing. It can also happen as bacteria literally transfer the resistant gene from one to the next through the process of conjugation. There's also plasmids, which are little circular pieces of DNA that have resistant genes in them that can go into the environment and be picked up by bacteria. So bacteria can share the resistant genes with others, which is kind of scary too. Okay, guys, last slide before we get really depressed. Let's look at this last one, funding healthcare. Heaviest burden of illness borne by the poorest people who can't afford a healthy environment or adequate healthcare. So while we are kind of sitting pretty here in the United States and developed countries, we see our poor neighbors and poor, I'll call them neighboring global community, really suffering. The World Health Organization estimates that 90% of all disease burden occurs in developing countries where less than 10% of all healthcare dollars are spent. So 90% of the disease burden, again, that includes disabilities, not just deaths, but people just struggling through injuries or for trauma or some type of infection or suffering. 90% of that suffering happens in these developing countries where only 10% of healthcare goes. It's sad, really, if you think about it. You think more developed countries might give more money. Right now, the rich countries give about $1 per person to poor countries. So $1 per U.S. citizen goes to help poor people in developing countries get through disease. Increased financial aid to developing countries could certainly reduce the spread of pathogens and help stabilize population growth, since parents whose children have a higher survival rate tend to have fewer offspring. So if we can increase the amount of money, some estimates are around $25 billion, and that would be among all the richer countries. If all the richer countries could combine to give $25 billion, that's not a big percentage of their GDP. Like, for example, if all of the richest countries gave the $25 billion, that's only about 0.1% of their annual gross domestic product, or GDP. That's not too much, just 0.1% gave, then we would see a great improvement. We'd save 8 million lives a year and probably boost the world economy. If we save 8 million people, those 8 million people can then byproducts and contribute to society, that alone could increase revenues and economics, and we actually would probably get all of our money back. You know, it's amazing. Also, terrorism and other things, you know, a lot of the social problems come from disease, and so if we can help people with health in general, we'll probably start to see less unrest, political unrest, which in the long run saves us more money. So maybe that little 0.1% could be increased, or if we could get to that 0.1%, maybe that tiny investment might produce great returns, even for our own social well-being and, you know, political and social stability. Anyway, lots of different things could come from this. Well, guys, yeah, lots to think about here in Chapter 8. I know it seems kind of depressing, but the whole chapter is on environmental health. It's important to talk about these things. We're going to talk about toxins, toxicology in class, where I look forward to seeing you next. Folks, if you have any questions, email me at mspath@wpcc.edu, or just bring your questions to class, where I'll see you next.